Beneath a dusty shoe shop lies a secret no one was meant to uncover. Welcome to Enigma Obieto. I am your host, Alexander. Let's keep the mystery alive. Comment below and share where you're tuning in from. Reading your thoughts always brings this channel to life. Let's begin. The sun shone with gentle indifference on the village of Little Whipcombe, dappling the green with gold and shadow as it filtered through the branches of ancient oaks. It was a Thursday, which in Little Whipcombe meant only one thing: the annual Garden Club Tia Gentile gathering of villagers, elder matrons, and enthusiastic horticulturists, held on the vicarage lawn with scones, jam, and the sharp tang of roses in bloom. Miss Marple, upright and delicate in a pale lavender cardigan, sat near the fringe of the assembly under a parasol with fading tassels. She sipped her tea with quiet grace, eyes half-lidded but watchful, and appeared to be listening vaguely to Mrs. Lillian Murchison's impassioned monologue on hybrid irises. In truth, her attention was divided between the guests and the peculiar absence of young Peter Bostwick, the vicar's nephew, who had taken up a summer job as apprentice to Mr. Harold Grimshaw, the village cobbler. The cobbler himself had just arrived, a stout man in brown tweed with thick grey eyebrows and a sour expression. He rarely came to such events, claiming correctly he had no time for idle chatter and finger sandwiches. Yet there he was, clutching a felt hat, looking uncomfortable, and Miss Marple noticed, pale about the lips. "Grimshaw," said Reverend Pelham, cheerful as ever, clapping the cobbler's back. "Good of you to come. Sit, there's sponge cake enough for all." Grimshaw sat, but uneasily. His eyes moved across the lawn, always returning to the path leading back toward his workshop, just across the green. Miss Marple's gaze followed him unconsciously, resting on the narrow shop front with its crooked window and modest sign Grimshaw Boots and Repair, established 1897. It wasn't long before a sudden hush spread across the gathering. Like a ripple in otherwise still water, Constable Ned Fowley appeared at the gate, breathless, a young lad at his side. "Begging your pardon, Vicar." "Ladies," he said, removing his helmet. "Uma, Grimshaw, it's your apprentice, Peter. I'm afraid there's been an incident." Grimshaw stood to quickly, his chair scraping harshly against the paving. His felt hat dropped unnoticed. "What incident?" he barked. Fowley hesitated. "Best if you come, sir. You too, Miss Marple. If you wouldn't mind, it was a most unusual request." Murmurs began immediately. Chairs shifted, teacups rattled on saucers. Miss Marple stood at once, politely excusing herself from Mrs. Murchison. She gathered her handbag and gloves with practiced calm, but her blue eyes, those keen, kindly eyes, sharpened imperceptibly by the time they reached the cobbler's shop. The scent of old polish and dust clung to the narrow walls. The back room door stood ajar. Fowley motioned toward it. Grimshaw rushed past and then stopped short. His heavy breathing echoed in the silence. Inside, beneath the wide worktable, sprawled Peter Bostwick, his head at an unnatural angle, a smear of dried blood matting his fair hair. One shoe rested, perfectly polished, on the stool beside him. The other was still unfinished. Miss Marple did not gasp or clutch at her pearls. Instead, she tilted her head ever so slightly and regarded the scene with grave stillness. "Murder," Grimshaw whispered hoarsely. "But why? He was just a boy." Miss Marple's voice was soft and laced with certainty. "That," she said, "is really the question. The real puzzle, I find, is who believed he wasn't merely a boy at all." By the time Miss Marple returned to the vicarage garden, the atmosphere had changed entirely. The late afternoon sun still filtered through the hedgerows, and the tea things remained, but the chatter had taken on a different tone, whispers laced with disbelief, wide eyes darting between neighbours, and the unmistakable scent of scandal in the air. News in a village like Little Whipcombe travelled in much the same way as ivy on a wall, persistent, quiet at first, but utterly invasive. within the hour. Every guest at the garden club tea had heard some version of the event, though none quite accurate, and all were eager to contribute their own theories. "I told my husband something was amiss with that boy weeks ago," said Mrs. Murchison, her voice pitched just loud enough to carry to 3 surrounding tables. "He had that furtive look, like he was hiding something dreadful." "Peter," exclaimed young Emily March, the schoolmistress, "he was bright and kind. He helped me carry library books from the hall just last week." "Yes, but kindness can be a very convenient cloak," muttered Mr. Wetherby, the retired solicitor, tapping ash from his pipe onto the manicured grass. "He was always sniffing around Grimshaw's back room. Not natural for a lad that age to be interested in cobbling, if you ask me." The vicar's wife, Mrs. Pelham, fluttered toward the knot of whispering villagers, clutching a linen handkerchief. "Please, everyone," she implored gently, "let's not speculate. It's a tragedy, to be sure, but the authorities must be allowed to investigate." "Quite right," Miss Marple said, appearing at her side with remarkable poise for someone who had just come from a scene of violent death. She folded her gloves with slow precision and placed them in her handbag. "Speculation, especially in its earliest form, has a way of leading people astray." That comment, though quietly delivered, had the immediate effect of silencing most of the group. Miss Marple's words in Little Wibcombe were never ignored. Though they were rarely dramatic, she had a way of making even the plainest observation feel significant. Still, the hush didn't last long. By sunset, a subdued melancholy had settled over the village. The garden club's tables were cleared, chairs stacked, and the final guests had departed in small, muttering pairs. Constable Fowley had returned to the cobbler's shop, joined by Sergeant Hargreaves from the nearby town of Lawtonbury, a sturdy man with an officious manner and little fondness for the over-involvement of villagers. Miss Marple, on the other hand, had not returned home immediately. She had taken the long route past the high hedges and low walls of Little Wibcombe's High Street. She paused outside the greengrocer's, where the striped awning now hung limp in the cooling breeze, and stared briefly at the cobbler's shop, cordoned now by a single rope and the quiet presence of the constable. The sign above the door swung slightly. Grimshaw, boots and repairs. The workshop lights were off. Later that evening, back in her modest sitting room on Church Lane, Miss Marple sat with a knitting basket untouched at her side and a book open in her lap. She had not read a page. The evening lamp cast a warm glow on her floral wallpaper, and from the corner of the room, the old mantel clock chimed 7. She recalled the scene clearly. Peter's legs splayed at odd angles, the blood seeping into the sawdust-strewn floor, the half-polished shoe resting with almost poetic indifference. It was not the violence of the act that troubled her, nor the youth of the victim, though both were lamentable, but rather the subtle dissonance in the room itself, a scuff on the workbench that didn't belong, the smell of something that wasn't leather or polish, the fact that Harold Grimshaw had called Peter just a boy, when Miss Marple distinctly remembered him complaining only last week that Peter poked his nose into business that wasn't his. There was a difference between boys and men in Little Wibcombe, and it wasn't always to do with age. The next morning, a grey mist blanketed the village like a damp sheet. It clung to chimneys and veiled the hedgerows in thin gauze. At the vicarage, Reverend Pelham ate his breakfast in distracted silence. Across the table, Mrs. Pelham folded the morning paper. "They've confirmed it," she said, her voice soft. "Murder. Blunt force trauma. Poor Peter." The vicar sighed. "To think such a thing could happen here." "Don't be foolish, dear," said Mrs. Pelham. "Things happen everywhere. They always have. We're simply better at hiding it in Little Wibcombe." She glanced out the window and spotted Miss Marple passing by the garden gate, umbrella in hand despite the light drizzle. The older woman's steps were steady, unhurried. but with that peculiar sense of purpose that always made Mrs. Pelham wonder what, precisely, she was thinking. Elsewhere in the village, Harold Grimshaw had refused breakfast and sat at his kitchen table with his coat still on. The constable had allowed him home under the condition that he remain available for questioning. And Grimshaw, clearly shaken, had complied. He stared into a cold teacup. Just a lad, he muttered again, didn't deserve it. He didn't notice that his left boot squeaked slightly as he tapped his foot at the village shop. Mrs. Denby handed out sugar and scandal with equal generosity. She leaned across the counter toward Mr. Weatherby. "Mark my words, it's the inheritance," she said in a hushed voice that carried none the less. "Peter stood to get a bit, didn't he?" After his uncle's passing, "Not much," Mr. Weatherby replied, though not with any real authority. "Enough for mischief, perhaps, not enough for murder, unless someone else thought he knew where more was hidden." This suggestion brought a new round of murmuring. Just before noon, Miss Marple visited the shop herself. Selecting a tin of condensed milk and some embroidery needles, she made light conversation with Mrs. Denby, all smiles and pleasantries, until she turned at the door and said quite lightly, "Tell me, my dear, has anyone seen Mr. Grimshaw's apprentice key?" Mrs. Denby blinked. "Hi, what? The duplicate to the workshop door. Peter had one, naturally, working so late. But I wonder if it's been found." Mrs. Denby looked vaguely alarmed. "Well, I suppose the constable." Miss Marple smiled. "Quiet, I shall ask him myself. Have a lovely afternoon." "Dear." She left before Mrs. Denby could formulate a proper reply. By early afternoon, Sergeant Hargreaves had set up in the town hall, making statements and filing reports with Constable Follies' help. The townspeople queued, some solemnly, others eagerly. One order found it terribly exciting. Miss Marple arrived without fanfare. She spoke to Fowley quietly and with a kind expression. "I believe," she said, "I may be able to offer something useful." Fowley, familiar with her ways, did not object. He led her in at once. Sergeant Hargreaves looked up with thinly veiled skepticism. "Yes, Miss Marple. Is it? Well, you're free to offer what you like. Though I'll warn you now, we're proceeding with interviews of known associates. We're considering a break-in gone wrong." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Indeed, and you believe that explains why Peter was killed in a room locked from the inside?" Hargreaves blinked. "Wellies, the door was locked, but he could have perhaps the killer left by the rear. There is no rear door," Miss Marple said mildly. "Only a window too small for a grown man." "I believe I mentioned it to Constable Fowley yesterday." Hargreaves looked to Fowley, who nodded uncomfortably. Miss Marple continued, as gently as if remarking on the weather. "Still, it's quite understandable to be misled. After all, murderers go to great lengths to disguise simple things, like the presence of a second key or a footprint in the wrong place or, indeed, a motive that appears too small to matter." She folded her hands in her lap. "But I suspect, Sergeant, that this motive is not so small after all. It may, in fact, be rather old." She smiled, serene as ever. "I shall, of course, leave it to your capable team, but if I were you, I would look not to the shop, but to what lies beneath it." And with that, she rose and took her leave, walking slowly into the mist, leaving Sergeant Hargreaves staring after her, bewildered. In Little Wibcombe, one never quite knew when the mystery had already begun to unravel quietly, beneath the surface, just as Miss Marple liked it. The mist that had blanketed Little Wibcombe throughout the morning showed no sign of lifting. It clung to the rooftops and softened the outlines of chimneys and steeples, as if the village itself were reluctant to be seen too clearly. The streets were quieter than usual for a market day. A few carts rolled by, wheels muffled on damp cobbles, and a pair of children were scolded by their nanny for skipping too close to the cordoned-off cobbler's shop, behind shuttered windows. Curtains twitched, the village held its breath. Miss Marple, however, was not idle. After leaving Sergeant Hargreaves with her gentle but unmistakable suggestion, she returned home for a light luncheon of soup and bread. Followed by a cup of strong Darjeeling, her cat, Bastable, purred contentedly. In the corner, unaware that his mistress's thoughts were not on her knitting, nor her usual afternoon radio program. She had seen enough in that cobbler's back room to know something was wrong, not just with the scene of the crime, but with the atmosphere that clung to it. It wasn't only the body. Tragic as Peter's death was, it was the suggestion of something hidden, forgotten. Perhaps, or deliberately buried. Miss Marple opened her writing desk, drew out a sheet of notepaper, and began listing the names of those closest to the situation. Peter Bostwick, deceased, apprentice, age 19, well-liked. No known enemies, lived with his aunt, Mrs. Agnes. Pritchard, Harold Grimshaw, cobbler, unmarried, reclusive, known to be temperamental, but not violent, employed Peter for 3 months. Mrs. Agnes Pritchard, widow. Resides in Rosehill Cottage, formerly a housekeeper in London, known for her fierce privacy and an excellent gooseberry fool. Sergeant Hargreaves, out-of-town investigator. Unfamiliar with local temperaments, Constable Fowley, trustworthy. If occasionally a bit green. Miss Marple's pen hesitated. She tapped it gently against her chin. There was something that had stirred in her memory, a name, a face, something old. And not spoken of in years. She set the pen down and reached for her telephone. Dr. Redding, please, she said when the operator came on. Yes, I'll hold. The village doctor, Henry Redding, was a tall, soft-spoken man with thinning hair and a habit of whistling under his breath when deep in thought. He had been in Little Winkham for over 30 years and knew the medical history of every living soul in the parish and a good number of the dead ones. He arrived half an hour later at Miss Marple's request, shaking the mist from his coat as he stepped inside. Tea, she offered. I won't say no. He replied, easing himself into her floral armchair. You said it was important. I just wanted to ask you a question about something rather old. Perhaps 15, 16 years ago, there was a man, an out-of-towner, who rented the old Whittaker property just behind the Cobblers. Redding frowned. Good heavens, you've a memory like a ledger. Yes, I do remember. Rufus Lane, his name was. Odd fellow. Claimed he was writing a book on 17th century guilds. Seemed harmless enough. But he wasn't. Was he? The doctor blinked. Now that you mention it, no, he wasn't. I believe he left rather suddenly. There were whispers, nothing proven, but enough to make people wary. Miss Marple stirred her tea, watching the steam rise. And did he know Harold Grimshaw? Redding shifted. Not that I ever saw. But Harold kept to himself. Even then, did anyone ever say what became of Mr. Lane? No, he simply disappeared one morning. Left behind some papers, a few books. The house was cleaned out by the landlord within a week. Miss Marple nodded once, as though she had expected this. Later that day, the conversation was still circling like crows over the village square. Mrs. Murchison had called on Mrs. Denby and shared a perfectly dreadful dream she had the night before, something involving Peter and a cellar. This, of course, was just the sort of thing to ignite further gossip. A cellar, Mrs. Denby repeated. There's no cellar in the Cobblers, is there? I shouldn't think so, said Mrs. Murchison. But you never really know with these old buildings. Secrets in the floorboards and all that. Word of the dream, once said, grew roots. By late afternoon, half the village had convinced itself that Peter had discovered something beneath the cobbler's floor, and that it had cost him his life, at Rosehill Cottage. Agnes Pritchard sat by her fireplace, a shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders despite the warmth of the flames. Her expression was unreadable. A single photograph rested on the mantelpiece as a child, no more than 8, grinning beside a snowman. She had raised the boy after his mother died of consumption in London, and she had done so fiercely. Some said too fiercely. There was a knock at the door. She opened it to find Miss Marple standing with her umbrella neatly furled. "Miss Marple," Agnes said with a stiff smile, "I thought you might come. May I sit for a moment?" Agnes hesitated, then nodded and stepped aside. The sitting room smelled faintly of lavender, and something older would polish and dust, and perhaps grief. "I won't pretend this is a social call," Miss Marple said kindly. "I know how fond you were of Peter." Agnes's lips tightened. "He was a good boy, curious, yes, but never unkind. Curiosity can be dangerous," Miss Marple murmured, "especially when it brushes against old wounds." There was a long pause. "You think he found something?" Agnes said at last, "I believe he may have, Miss." Marple replied, "Not by design, perhaps, but by accident. A misplaced board, a forgotten box, even a letter. Something someone wanted kept quiet." Agnes looked at the fire. "I warned him. I told him not to snoop around, but he wouldn't listen. Said something wasn't right at Grimshaw's." Miss Marple leaned in slightly. "Did he ever mention the name Rufus Lane?" Agnes went very still. "Where did you hear that name?" "An old memory. One I believe Peter stumbled upon, quite by chance, you see. I suspect that what lies beneath the cobbler's floor isn't just shoes and nails, it's something older, something someone tried to hide." Agnes pressed her fingers together tightly, white-knuckled. "I don't know anything about that," she said in a voice that was far too quick. "And even if I did, it's too late for Peter." Miss Marple stood, gathering her umbrella. "For Peter, yes, but not for the truth." That evening, as the mist thickened into fog, Sergeant Hargreaves sent for a carpenter to inspect the floor of the workshop. They worked by lantern light, lifting boards one by one while Constable Fowley looked on nervously. It was nearly midnight when they found it, a shallow pit beneath the cobbler's worktable. Inside the rusted outline of a long-forgotten strongbox, its lock is broken, scattered remnants of parchment, wax seals, a cracked ceramic inkwell, and something else tattered cloth, brittle with age. No one spoke for a long time, at that very hour. In her sitting room, Miss Marple sat once again beside her untouched knitting. The cat curled at her feet and stared as the clock struck midnight. The mystery was beginning to take shape, not through science or fingerprints, but through threads of memory, behavior, and something altogether more human. She whispered, more to herself than anyone. People so often forget it isn't the secrets that destroy us. It's the lengths we go to in keeping them. And with that, she reached for her teacup and sipped, her expression unreadable. The storm beneath the cobbler's floor had only just begun to rise. The fog still lingered over Little Wibcombe the next morning, now yellowed slightly by the rising sun. It was the sort of weather that felt uncertain, reluctant to commit to the clarity of day or the concealment of night. Shop doors opened slowly, if at all, and the usual bustle of foot traffic along the high street was subdued, weighed down by the events of the past 48 hours. The discovery beneath the cobbler's floor had been kept quiet, as much as was possible in a village like Little Wibcombe, but news has a way of slipping through even the narrowest of cracks. By midday, it was no longer a matter of speculation, but near certainty. Something had been buried beneath Harold Grimshaw's shop, something old, possibly valuable, possibly incriminating. At the village hall, Sergeant Hargreaves stood over a desk piled with notes, reports, and sketches of the cobbler's workshop. He rubbed his temples as Constable Fowley entered with 2 mugs of tea. "Both lukewarm, they'll want answers soon," Hargreaves muttered, not looking up. "Wouldn't be Little Wibcombe if they didn't," Fowley replied, placing the mugs down. "They're chewing over it already. Half the village thinks the boy was murdered over treasure, and the other half, secrets, sir, or ghosts, depending who you ask." Hargreaves exhaled deeply, setting aside a file marked P. Bostwick, fatality. "We're not chasing phantoms," he said. "This is murder. And every murder has motive, means, and opportunity. Right now, all three lead us to one man, Grimshaw. Grimshaw, indeed." The cobbler had become the first and most obvious suspect. His shop, his apprentice, his tools, his temper. The case, to any methodical outsider, pointed neatly to him. Hargreaves intended to follow that line unless or until it no longer held. At that very moment, Harold Grimshaw sat at his kitchen table once more, his back hunched and his eyes heavy-lidded. He hadn't slept properly since the discovery. The carpenter's lifting of the floorboards had revealed more than just a hidden cache of documents. It had exposed something much worse, his ignorance of what had been right beneath his feet for decades. He stirred his tea without drinking, staring at the wall as if it might offer answers. He didn't know about any strongbox, he didn't know about parchment, or hidden chambers, or dusty records, and most of all, he didn't know why Peter had been killed. But someone wanted it to seem like he did. There came a knock at the door. He opened it slowly, finding Miss Marple standing, their umbrella once more in hand, though the skies were clear. "Miss Marple," he muttered, "you're brave, calling on the village villain. You're no villain, Mr. Grimshaw," she said pleasantly, "and even if you were, I do like a spot of tea with my criminals." "May I?" Grimshaw grunted but stepped aside. She entered, settling into the same chair she'd occupied 3 years prior during a shoe fitting. The memory of that quiet, uneventful visit struck him suddenly, sharply. "I hear the police are looking at you," she said, folding her gloves neatly into her lap. "They would be fools not to." He replied, his voice hoarse, "It's my shop. I was the last person to see Peter alive. He had keys, I have tools, and I've never liked people much." Miss Marple inclined her head as if agreeing. "Still, many people in this village fit portions of that profile. Privacy is not quite the same as guilt, is it?" Grimshaw stared at her for a long moment. "You really think someone else did it?" "I think Peter knew something he shouldn't," she said softly, "and I think someone wanted to ensure he never shared it." He exhaled, a long and slow release of air, as though it had been caught in his chest for days. "I didn't kill him," he said. "But I might as well have. If he hadn't been nosing around my shop, he would have been nosing somewhere else," she interrupted gently. "That's the nature of curious young men." They sat in silence for a while. "What was in that box, do you suppose?" he asked. "I have a few ideas," she replied. "But what concerns me more is who knew it was there in the first place." Later that afternoon, Sergeant Hargreaves began formal interviews. Grimshaw was first. He offered no resistance, no protest. He simply told his version of events succinctly, quietly, and consistently. "I heard nothing. I was upstairs for barely 15 minutes. When I returned, he was already gone." Hargreaves repeated, "Dead, you mean?" Grimshaw nodded. "He was slumped. There was blood. The shoe hadn't been finished. I didn't touch him. I knew what it would look like." "And you expect me to believe someone entered your shop, murdered your apprentice, and left in 15 minutes without being seen? I expect you to believe what I told you," Grimshaw said calmly. Miss Marple was not present at the interview, but she heard enough by evening. The village was abuzz once more, and new rumours had begun to take shape, subtly, quietly. Mrs. Denby swore she'd seen Mrs. Agnes Pritchard at the cobbler's shop a week prior, arguing quite sharply with Peter. The matter, she said, seemed private, emotional. Miss Emily March recalled Peter appearing distracted for the last fortnight. He kept asking about the village's history, about old properties and landlords. I assumed it was some school project. Mr. Weatherby offered his own theory at the pub that evening. He found something he wasn't meant to, he told the innkeeper. Something someone else had a claim to. That sort of thing can turn deadly. By sundown, suspicion had widened. Agnes Pritchard was now firmly in the villagers' crosshairs. An overprotective aunt, former housekeeper, perhaps privy to secrets from a past life. At Rosehill Cottage, Agnes noticed it too. People lingered longer at her garden gate. Her post arrived late. A child who had once fetched her groceries did not come. She sat in her armchair, listening to the fire crackle, as Miss Marple entered without fanfare. "Have you come to accuse me?" Agnes asked coldly. "Not at all," said Miss Marple. "I came because I think you are in danger of being wrongly accused." Agnes's eyes flickered. "They think I did it. They think I killed him." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "but it is not what they think that matters. It is what they believe they know, and what they know, Agnes, may be very wrong." She leaned in slightly, her voice dropping. Peter asked questions about history, about people. About a man named Rufus Lane. Agnes stood sharply, knocking a teacup off its saucer. "You leave that name be," she snapped. Miss Marple did not flinch. "I would, if it were only a name. But Rufus Lane lived here, and then he vanished, and now, beneath the floor, we've found documents that may belong to him." Agnes trembled slightly. "He wasn't a good man," she whispered. "He did things, took things, from people who couldn't say no." There were whispers. "And then he left, or someone made him leave." Miss Marple rose. "Agnes, I need to know, was Peter close to finding out what happened to Rufus Lane?" Agnes didn't reply. But her silence spoke volumes. Outside, the fog returned, heavier than the night before, and in the distance, beyond the vicarage and the square, beyond the bakers and the milliners and the quiet street lamps flickering to life, one person watched the cottage from beneath a dark umbrella, a shadow, still and patient, blending with the mist, waiting. The circle of suspicion had widened, but the true motive, Miss Marple knew, was still just beyond reach, and it would require one final, crucial observation to bring it fully into the light. A chill had returned to Little Winkham, by morning, not merely in the air, but in the very manner of the villagers. Here once greetings flowed easily across fences and hedgerows, now glances were exchanged in silence, and front doors lingered a little longer on their latches. No one wished to say the word murder aloud, but it hung in every conversation like a thick fog that refused to lift. The cobbler's shop remained closed, its crooked sign swinging gently in the breeze, as if to remind passers-by that death had passed through those doors. And though Sergeant Hargreaves had made no official announcement, the assumption among most was clear: Peter Bostwick had stumbled upon something long buried, and had paid dearly for it. Miss Marple, ever unobtrusive, had spent the morning in the small, wood-panelled reading room adjoining the church. It was seldom used except for rummage sales and the occasional poetry group, which made it ideal for quiet reflection. She was seated at a wide oak table, a stack of parish records beside her, her spectacles perched neatly on the bridge of her nose. She was not there for poetry. Carefully she leafed through the records, old maps, property ledgers, notices of inheritance, and tenant registers. Most of it was familiar, as all village records tend to be to those who have lived in a place long enough. But Miss Marple was not looking for the familiar. She was looking for something that had once been there, and no longer was. It took over an hour, but she found it. An 1887 listing for the Whittaker estate, now the site of Grimshaw's cobbler shop. The document recorded a transfer of ownership not to the Grimshaw family, as commonly believed, but to a man named Theophilus Cartwright. It was Cartwright's name that remained on the title for nearly 20 years until, quite abruptly, it vanished. There was no notice of sale, no probate, no inheritance record, and yet by 1910, the shop was operating under the name of Harold Grimshaw's father. Miss Marple blinked slowly. That was curious, very curious indeed. She rose, placed the document carefully back into its box, and closed the lid with a soft thud. Outside. The church bell rang for a quarter hour. Across the village, Sergeant Hargreaves was finishing his second round of interviews. His manner had grown more clipped in the past 24 hours, his patience thinned by the lack of definitive evidence. Harold Grimshaw remained the prime suspect, but with no witnesses and nothing tying him directly to the act, his guilt remained a matter of strong probability rather than certainty. Agnes Pritchard's evasiveness hadn't helped her case, either. The widow had refused to offer further comment about Rufus Lane or Peter's inquiries. When pressed, she'd claimed poor memory, a weak heart, and an urgent desire to be left in peace. Still, the townspeople were growing restless. It was not enough to suspect. They wanted to know, and knowing, in Little Whipcombe, came only when Miss Marple had something to say. She left the church reading room and made her way through the village green, nodding politely to Mrs. Murchison and Mr. Wetherby, who were in the midst of a tense disagreement about the value of old coin collections. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled at the scene, though her mind was already far beyond the green. Turning over possibilities, she paused in front of the cobbler's shop, eyeing the warped door frame and crooked shutters. Then she noticed something odd. There was a glint of light in the corner of the window, something wedged between the glass and the sill. She moved closer, peering in. It was a small, torn fragment of paper, tucked awkwardly behind the curtain as if it had blown in during the commotion and been forgotten. She reached in through the slightly ajar window pane and retrieved it. The paper was no larger than a visiting card, brittle at the edges, and covered in hurried handwriting. The ink had bled from moisture, but a few words remained legible. Cartwright hid the key beneath Miss Marple's lips pressed together. She turned the card over, and her brow furrowed. A name was scribbled on the back, half-added, but unmistakable. Elaine it was. She thought, almost too neat, too convenient. But not for her, for someone who had perhaps meant to destroy it, only to lose it in the chaos of Peter's death. She tucked the paper into her handbag and walked briskly to the one person who might be able to clarify what she had found. Mr. Edward Bellamy was the village's unofficial historian, a man of impeccable routine and even more impeccable memory. He had once taught classics at a grammar school in Canterbury, but had returned to Little Wycombe in retirement, where he now lived with 3 cats, 12 clocks, and a remarkable collection of antique weather vanes. Miss Marple found him in his sitting room, sorting through a tray of Roman coins. "Miss Marple," he said, delighted. "What a rare pleasure. Do sit down." "I was just contemplating the absurdity of Emperor Maximinus's coinage, Mr. Bellamy," she began with a warm smile. "I was hoping you might help me with a name." He perked up immediately. "Cartwright, Theophilus Cartwright, lived in the village late 19th century, possibly into the early 1900s. Bellamy's brow furrowed. "Ah yes, Theophilus, odd fellow. Dabbled in alchemy, if I recall. There were rumours, of course, of buried manuscripts, secret societies, old guild matters." "Was he connected in any way to Rufus Lane?" Bellamy's expression changed. "Now that's a name I haven't heard in many years. Rufus Lane came much later, 1920s or thereabouts. Claimed to be researching Cartwright's life, said he was writing a book, and did he ever finish it? Vanished before he could, left in a terrible hurry. Some say he was run over by the landlord. Others claimed he found something in the shop that frightened him." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And the shop itself was never known to have a cellar." Bellamy leaned back. "Not officially, but Theophilus was rumoured to have added a hidden storage room. It wasn't uncommon back then, smugglers and hoarders alike. The old village guilds were secretive. If Peter found something under that floor, Miss Marple, it may have been hidden for more than a century. She left soon after, her mind sharper than ever. the paper in her handbag, the forgotten name in the parish records. The shop's obscure transfer of ownership each was a thread, and Peter, poor Peter, had begun to weave them together. That evening she returned once more to Rosehill Cottage. Agnes Pritchard opened the door, wearied. He was asking about Cartwright. Miss Marple said, without preamble, and about Lane. He found something. You know he did. Agnes's hands trembled. I begged him to stop, she said. I told him it was dangerous. What did he find? Agnes hesitated. Then, in a whisper, he found letters, old letters, from Cartwright to Lane. Mentions of a hidden strongbox, something called the Order of the Soul. I thought it was nonsense, but Peter thought it meant something. Miss Marple was silent for a moment, letting the name settle. Order of the Soul. Not a religious order, but a guild, a cobbler's guild, perhaps, ancient. Secretive, and with something valuable enough to kill over. Someone else must have known, Miss Marple said quietly. Someone who knew Peter had found too much, and in the growing dark beyond the window pane, a shadow moved past the garden hedge. Unseen by either of the women, the killer, Miss Marple thought, was not far at all, and still she had one final move to make, but it would require bait, and Peter's unfinished shoe might be just the thing. It was just after 7 in the evening, and the lamps along the high street glowed faintly through a thin veil of drizzle, their flickering light casting wavering reflections on the slick cobblestones. The village of Little Whipcombe, usually tranquil by this hour, now felt expectant, as though something unsaid hovered just beneath the surface, waiting to be disturbed. Miss Marple stood at the edge of the village green, her umbrella resting on one arm, watching the silhouettes of villagers going about their twilight routines. But she wasn't here for the view, she was waiting. From the far end of the green, footsteps approached. Purposeful but cautious, Reverend Pelham, wrapped in his worn brown coat, came into sight. He had received Miss Marple's request for a quiet word not long after evensong. My dear Miss Marple, he greeted me with a polite smile. You've chosen a rather damp evening for a meeting. Miss Marple nodded gently. Some things prefer dampness, I've found. Secrets, for example. The vicar tilted his head. I'm wondering, she continued, if you might know whether any church records, particularly those from the late 1800s, were ever removed or destroyed. Anything to do with Theophilus Cartwright or Rufus Lane. The vicar gave her a surprised look. That's a rather specific inquiry. It is, Miss Marple admitted. I recently discovered Cartwright's name on the original deed for the Cobbler's premises, but there's no record of transfer to the Grimshaw family. No sale. It simply disappeared. Pelham's brow furrowed. Now that you mention it. There was a box of sealed church documents from some of the older registries. It was brought to me last year when we did the attic clear out, but I never had time to go through it properly. I believe Peter did, Miss Marple said quietly. There was a long silence. I see. The vicar finally replied. And you believe what he discovered may have led to his death? I do, she answered. But it wasn't just the documents, it was the implication. Something he intended to confront someone about. Reverend Pelham looked down at his shoes. Then the truth is more dangerous than we imagined. Truth often is, Miss Marple said. Especially when it threatens reputations or legacies. The vicar hesitated, then gave a solemn nod. I'll retrieve that box. Thank you, Reverend, but please discreetly. As the vicar walked off, Miss Marple stood a moment longer under the street lamp, her thoughts already shifting. There were still two people she needed to speak with, people who, she suspected, had more to reveal than they had let on. The first was Miss Emily March, the schoolmistress. She lived in a modest cottage near the edge of the village, with a tidy garden and a library twice the size of her sitting room. Emily was a woman of sharp intellect and deeper sympathies than she allowed others to see. When Miss Marple knocked on her door that evening, Emily opened it with a slightly wary expression. "Miss Marple," she said, "is this about Peter?" "It is." Emily let her in, gesturing toward the hearth where a small fire smouldered. "I was fond of him," Emily said before Miss Marple could even sit down. "He reminded me of one of my students years ago, clever, too curious for his own good." "I told him to be careful. You said before that Peter had been asking about history," Miss Marple said gently. "May I ask what sort of history?" Emily sat forward. "He wanted to know about village guilds, old trades, things that had been banned, covered up, or otherwise made to disappear. He was convinced there was something beneath the cobbler's shop. I thought he meant metaphorically." Miss Marple gave a faint smile. "He may have meant both." Emily hesitated. "There's something else. He showed me a letter, said it was from someone named Resurface Lane. I barely had time to read it before he tucked it away again. It was full of strange references, orders, allegiances. He believed it connected the Grimshaw family to something that shouldn't have survived." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Did he say what he planned to do with it? He was going to show it to Harold Grimshaw," Emily said quietly. "He wanted to confront him. I told him to wait, to let someone else read it first. He said he'd already made a copy." Miss Marple nodded. "Thank you, my dear. That may be the most important detail yet." Later that night, Miss Marple climbed the narrow path to the edge of the village where the old mill stood, long since out of use. Just beyond it was a row of cottages, one of which belonged to Mr. Weatherby, the retired solicitor. He had not been called upon yet, and Miss Marple had a feeling that was an oversight worth correcting. Weatherby opened the door in his shirt sleeves, clearly surprised to see her. "I was just reviewing my notes from the Coin Club," he said. "You've caught me at a dull hour." "Perfect," Miss Marple said with a smile. "Dull hours tend to produce the most illuminating truths." Weatherby raised a brow, but invited her in. Once seated, Miss Marple wasted little time. "Mr. Weatherby," she began, "you handled the Grimshaw estate some years ago, did you not?" "I did," he said cautiously, though it was largely routine. "Harold's father left everything to him, and before that, the ownership of the shop." Weatherby shifted. There was a discrepancy. "The title was contested once, many years back. A man claiming descent from Theophilus Cartwright sent a letter of protest. But there was no formal record, no will, no surviving relatives. It was dismissed." "Was that man Rufus Lane?" Miss Marple asked. Weatherby looked startled. "Yes, actually." "Good heavens. How do you know all this?" "Because Peter Bostwick found the original Cartwright letters beneath the floor, and because I believe Rufus Lane never left the village of his own accord. He was silenced, possibly permanently, because he came too close to exposing something." Weatherby went pale. "You can't be serious." "I am, and I believe someone else knew, someone still among us." The old solicitor stood, gripping the edge of the mantel. "You must be very careful, Miss Marple." "Oh, I always am," she replied calmly. Back in her own cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire as the wind began to rise beyond the panes. Her knitting lay untouched beside her. Everything was narrowing. The lies, the motives, the alibis. She had the missing link now, the copy Peter had made of the letter, which must still exist somewhere, and the unfinished shoe. It was time to set the trap, not with accusation, but with precision. Tomorrow she would ask Constable Foley too. Deliver a message that would suggest Peter's copy had been found and would be presented at a public meeting in the village hall. If someone had killed to bury the truth once, they would surely kill to stop it from being read, and when they came, Miss Marple would be waiting with a cup of tea, a sharp eye, and a quiet certainty that murder, like guilt, always returns to the scene. The next morning dawned sharp and clear. The mist of the past week finally burned off by a pale sun that glanced across the rooftops of Little Winkham like a lantern peeking through a drawn curtain. It was, by all accounts, a deceptively beautiful day, a contrast to the tension that gripped the village just beneath the surface. Miss Marple rose early. Her breakfast was modest, a slice of toast, a boiled egg, and a single cup of tea, but her thoughts were already many steps ahead. She moved about her sitting room with purpose, collecting her handbag, adjusting her cardigan, and neatly folding away a letter that had been delivered late the night before. The letter was unsigned. It had slipped through her door in an unmarked envelope. The message was brief. Stop asking questions. Let the dead stay buried. There was no mistaking the threat, veiled though it may have been. But Miss Marple, far from alarmed, had responded in the only way she knew how, with quiet resolve. A threat, after all, was often the last resort of a desperate person, and desperation, to a mind like hers, was as revealing as a confession. By 10 o'clock, the false rumour had taken root. Constable Fowley had, as instructed, made a few discreet rounds in the village square, stopping just long enough near Mrs. Denby's shop and outside the post office to be overheard, saying, "They've got it all right. Peter's copy. They're going to read it aloud this evening at the hall." Within the hour, everyone in Little Winkham knew, and by noon, Miss Marple noticed subtle changes. A few faces that had been hidden indoors for days reappeared. Weatherby strolled the green under the pretence of needing fresh air. Agnes Pritchard was seen buying tinned ham at the grocer's, though she rarely ate meat. Emily March visited the vicarage twice, once with a stack of books, once with none. And Harold Grimshaw stayed home, but Miss Marple had already paid him a quiet visit earlier that morning. She found the cobbler seated by the window, staring out across the muddy road toward the shop he had not dared reopen. His eyes were bloodshot, his face pale, but his mind, Miss Marple noted, was clear. "I need to know what Peter was working on the morning he died," she said, "what he had in his hands." Grimshaw hesitated, then pointed to a canvas sack near the door. "His last job. A man's boot, old, worn through the sole. He was halfway done." Miss Marple examined the boot. It was wellest, sturdy, but what caught her eye was the stitching inside the heel recently, not original, a patch, sewn inward, and something hard beneath the leather. She worked it loose with delicate fingers and found a folded slip of paper. Tucked inside, rolled tight as a cigarette, it was the copy, Peter's copy of the letter from Rufus Lane. She did not read it in front of Grimshaw. She only smiled gently, thanked him, and left. The boy had been cleverer than anyone suspected. He had hidden the copy not in his room, or among his aunt's papers, but within the very thing he had died trying to finish. By mid-afternoon, the village was restless. The rumour had bloomed like a particularly stubborn weed, persistent, tangled, and now impossible to control, at the vicarage. Preparations were being made for an informal gathering. It had been arranged. Under the guise of a community update, Miss Marple had convinced Reverend Pelham that it would be the most effective way to draw everyone together without inviting further gossip. The hall would be opened, tea and sandwiches provided, and Sergeant Hargreaves would be in attendance, not that the villagers minded. They welcomed the presence of someone who might finally declare a name. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had no intention of declaring anything. Not yet. She spent the hour before dusk walking the outskirts of the green, speaking briefly with a handful of familiar faces. Her questions were gentle, off-handed, about the weather, the garden club's next meeting, and whether anyone had seen Peter near the vicarage before his death. Few had, but one reply stopped her cold. Mrs. Pelham, the vicar's wife, mentioned quite naturally, "Oh, I think I did see him that morning. Yes, now that I think of it, he came to the side gate, knocked once, and then walked off. It was just Before the tea, Miss Marple blinked. Did he speak to anyone? I assumed he was looking for Reverend Pelham, but Edward was already in the church by then. I didn't think much of it, but Miss Marple did. Peter had gone to the vicarage that morning. He had something important, perhaps the copy, perhaps a question, and then he turned back. Had he changed his mind, or had someone intercepted him? At 6 o'clock, the church hall began to fill. Rows of folding chairs had been set out beneath the high, beamed ceiling. Tea urns steamed at the back of the room, and small plates of biscuits lined the table. The villagers filed in slowly, conversations hushed, eyes flicking to one another with wary curiosity. Sergeant Hargreaves stood near the front, arms folded. Constable Fowley hovered beside him, clearly uncertain of the gathering's true purpose. Miss Marple arrived quietly and took a seat in the front row, within minutes. Nearly the entire village had assembled. Mr. Wetherby, Emily March, Mrs. Denby, Agnes Pritchard, pale and composed, Reverend Pelham and his wife, and at the back, standing stiffly near the door, Harold Grimshaw. When the vicar stepped forward to speak, the room fell silent. "My dear friends," he began, "we gathered this evening not to accuse, but to reflect. A young man has lost his life. Our village has been shaken, but we are a community, and as such, we must come together. Now, I believe Miss Marple has something to share." She rose slowly. "My friends," she said gently, "there has been much talk about what Peter Bostwick may or may not have discovered. But I would like to remind you all that truth does not hide forever, and sometimes it reveals itself in the smallest of things." She held up a slip of paper. "This was found inside the shoe Peter was repairing when he died." A collective gasp swept through the hall. Eyes widened. A few leaned forward, as if to read the faded ink from their seats. Miss Marple did not read it aloud. Instead, she looked around the room slowly, pausing at each face. "It is a copy of a letter written by Rufus Lane," she continued, "a letter addressed to a solicitor in London, claiming rightful ownership of the property now known as the Cobbler's shop. And it includes a list of items, parchments, seals, documents belonging to the Order of the Soul, a medieval guild long thought defunct." Another murmur spread through the crowd. "The letter never made it to London," Miss Marple said. "Rufus Lane disappeared shortly after writing it, and now, decades later, Peter discovered the original and intended to expose the truth. He believed the property was never legally transferred to the Grimshaw family, that the hidden room beneath the shop still contained evidence of the order, and perhaps that someone else had been hiding its existence for their own reasons." She paused. "And so he died." For a long moment, no one moved. Then someone stood. It was Agnes Pritchard. Her voice, though trembling, was clear. "I knew he'd found something," she said. "I warned him. I told him it was dangerous." Miss Marple nodded kindly. "Yes, and so did others. But there is still one more truth to come." She turned her eyes slowly to the back of the room, because someone in this hall intercepted Peter that morning. Someone who feared exposure, not because of the shop's ownership, but because of what else the letter mentioned. The crowd turned. Grimshaw stepped back, his face pale. But Miss Marple wasn't looking at him. She was looking at Mr. Wetherby. The solicitor stood frozen, one hand clenched tightly around his cane. She said nothing more. Not yet, but the trap had sprung, and tomorrow the truth would rise fully, irrevocably. And without shadow, the silence in the village hall had been suffocating. Every eye had followed Miss Marple's slow, deliberate gaze as it landed on Mr. Wetherby, the retired solicitor who, until now, had managed to keep himself neatly removed from the heart of the storm. But a good mask, Miss Marple knew, could only hold as long as the wearer believed no one was watching. She said nothing more that evening. Instead, she folded the slip of paper carefully, handed it to Sergeant Hargreaves, and offered a modest smile to the gathered villagers. Perhaps we all need a night to consider what Peter's discovery truly means, she said gently, and whom it might have frightened. Then she turned, picked up her handbag, and walked out into the crisp night air, leaving a room filled with restless silence and rising suspicion. Mr. Weatherby had not moved during her speech, not once. By the next morning, the village was awash in speculation. The whole meeting had passed from person to person like a story too wild to believe, but too compelling to ignore. Some were certain Grimshaw had finally been cleared. Others whispered that Agnes Pritchard knew more than she dared say. But more and more, the name on people's lips was Weatherby. Miss Marple, however, spent the morning in her garden, pruning the climbing rose on her trellis with delicate, precise movements. There was something about gardening, she always said, that helped one think clearly. Roots, like secrets, often ran deeper than expected, and sometimes what bloomed above was entirely different from what lay below. At 10:30, Constable Fowley arrived at her gate, hat in hand, shoes wet with dew. "I brought the copy, Miss Marple," he said quietly. "Sergeant Hargreaves read it last night. He says it's genuine. Cartwright's name, Lane's notes, mentions of property. Yes, but also money, old funds, possibly gold." Said Miss Marple, carefully clipping a faded blossom. "So it's about treasure now, it may be." She nodded thoughtfully. "I wonder, Constable, if you might deliver a message for me to Mr. Weatherby." Fowley looked surprised but nodded. "What should I say? That I found something in Peter's shoe, a second note, one not shared last night, and that I'd like to return it to its rightful owner, here at my cottage, tomorrow at 2. Fowley looked startled. "That'll rattle him." "Surely, I do hope so," said Miss Marple, snipping another rose. "Rattling is sometimes the best way to make something fall loose." The following day dawned grey and windless. The village, though outwardly calm, hummed with quiet anticipation. Those who had spoken at the hall 2 nights prior now lingered in shops longer than necessary, watching and listening. Mr. Weatherby, for his part, had remained unusually absent from his usual routine. He hadn't stopped by the post office, he hadn't visited the green or shone his face near the churchyard. Even his blinds had remained drawn, an unusual sign for a man typically so proud of his punctuality. But at precisely 2:01, his figure appeared at the bend in the lane that led to Church Lane, walking slowly, but with purpose. Miss Marple met him at the door with her usual calm. "Mr. Weatherby," she said with a mild smile, "do come in, I've just made tea." He nodded stiffly and followed her into the sitting room. "Milk and sugar?" she asked. "Neither, thank you," he said, his voice dry. They sat opposite one another by the fire, the tea tray placed neatly between them. "I received your message," he said at last. "I'm curious to see what this second note says." Miss Marple gave a serene smile. "As am I." She reached into her knitting basket and removed a folded piece of Pepernit, the copy, but a blank slip made to look aged, with a few scribbled words in faded ink. Weatherby reached for it, but she held it just out of his grasp. "Before I handed it over," she said gently, "may I ask you something?" He stiffened but gave a curt nod. "When you handled the Grimshaw estate," she began, "you said there was a letter of protest from Lane, but you told me it was dismissed." "Yes, and yet you kept it." He blinked. "I'm a solicitor. I keep records. And you kept the original deed, too," she continued. "The one that proves Cartwright never sold the property. The one that names Lane as next of kin. A rather damning piece of paper to keep tucked away in your files." Weatherby opened his mouth to speak, but said nothing. Miss Marple leaned in slightly. "You see, I don't believe you dismissed Lane's claim because it lacked merit. I believe you dismissed it because if it were proven, someone else would lose. Someone you represented. He was silent. Someone who promised you a share of what was hidden beneath that floor. Still, he said nothing. His hands, resting on his knees, had gone rigid. And when Peter Bostwick came to you with his copy because he did, didn't he? You tried to convince him to stay quiet, to hand it over. But he refused. Weatherby looked down. Miss Marple's voice softened, though her eyes remained sharp, so you followed him. To the shop, you watched him go inside. And when Grimshaw left the room you went in, there was no response. You didn't mean to kill him, she added gently. You meant to frighten him, perhaps to search for him. But he struggled. You struck out, and he fell. Still, Weatherby didn't move. Finally, Miss Marple passed him the false letter. He unfolded it, stared at the meaningless scribbles, and let out a breathless, bitter laugh. You clever woman, he said quietly. I suppose you want me to confess. Miss Marple stirred her tea. I imagine Sergeant Hargreaves will ask for a full statement, she said, but that is, of course, entirely up to you. Outside, footsteps approached. Constable Fowley stepped in through the gate, followed closely by Hargreaves. Miss Marple stood. I'm afraid the tea's gone cold, she said pleasantly. But I do believe you'll have company for the rest of the afternoon. Weatherby rose slowly, folding the paper in his hand with an oddly peaceful expression. I never wanted to kill him, he said, but when I saw what he had I knew I'd lose everything. Miss Marple nodded once. Murder, she said gently, is rarely about passion, Mr. Weatherby. More often, it is about fear, and the most dangerous fear of all is being found out, as the constable escorted him out. Hargreaves gave Miss Marple a look that mingled admiration with mild exasperation. You knew it was him all along. She shook her head. I suspected. But it was only when he didn't ask what was written in the second note that I knew for certain. A man like Mr. Weatherby would have insisted on knowing every detail unless, of course, he already knew exactly what it said. She poured herself a fresh cup of tea and added a single sugar cube. Now, she murmured, I do believe the roses need trimming again. Outside, the village of Little Wibcombe stirred with the first hints of calm returning. Doors opened, curtains fluttered, life resumed, but in one small cottage on Church Lane. A woman with white hair and keen eyes watched quietly from behind. Her rose trellis, her mind already at work on the next question waiting to be answered. The wind returned the following morning, a cool and whispering current that rustled the leaves outside Miss Marple's window and swept across the village green like a messenger finally unburdened. Rain had softened the ground overnight, and the scent of earth and lavender clung faintly to the hedgerows. Little Wickham was beginning, cautiously, to exhale inside her sitting room. Miss Marple sipped her morning tea and glanced once more at the letter Rufus Lane had written nearly 4 decades earlier. She had read it several times now. Not for content, she already understood what it said, but for the intention behind the words. It was a letter meant to reclaim something lost. To unearth what had been buried not just beneath floorboards, but beneath. Lies, greed, and silence, and Peter Bostwick, clever, kind, and far too bold for his own good, had pulled at the wrong thread. The village had not yet fully adjusted to the news of Mr. Weatherby's arrest. To those who had known him only as a reserved, meticulous man with an eye for antique coins and the bylaws of Victorian wills, it had come as a quiet shock. There had been no grand confession. No breakdown at the church hall, but his statement to Sergeant Hargreaves had been sufficient. He had seen Peter that morning. The boy had come to him with the letter, hopeful, perhaps even a little triumphant. Weatherby had tried to reason with him, to convince him the discovery was dangerous and best left alone, but Peter was determined to make the truth public. Weatherby followed him back to the shop, waiting outside. When Grimshaw left the workshop, Weatherby entered, hoping to retrieve the letter or destroy it. Peter had resisted, and in the struggle that followed, A blow meant only to intimidate had ended his life. Miss Marple understood that much. But the true revelation what had truly prompted the murder had not been the documents or the old ownership claims. Those were merely triggers. The deeper motive, as always, lay in human nature. Later that day, the vicarage hosted an informal gathering, subdued but heartfelt. Reverend Pelham had suggested a moment of remembrance for Peter, and most of the village came. The affair was simple, no speeches, no hymn sheets, only quiet reflection in the garden where, only a week ago, tea and scones had been served under a summer sun. Miss Marple stood among them, observing more than participating, as was her way. She noted the expressions solemnly, yes, but also relieved. Just as quiet and understated had been served. Still, there were loose threads, and Miss Marple never left a tapestry unfinished. Later, as the crowd thinned and most returned to their homes, she found herself beside Harold Grimshaw, who stood awkwardly at the edge of the vicarage path, hands in pockets. Eyes fixed on the gravel. "You're a free man now, Mr. Grimshaw," she said gently. He gave a grunt of acknowledgement. "Don't feel much like one." "No, I imagine not, but the truth, once out, is a kind of freedom, even if it leaves you exposed." He gave her a sideways glance. "He was a good boy. I didn't say it before. Too proud, maybe. But he was." "I know," she said kindly. "He saw something others missed. Not just the documents. He saw that justice had been delayed, and he wanted to set it right." Grimshaw sighed. "And it got him killed." "Yes," she said, "but the blame does not rest with you." He didn't answer, but he didn't argue either. They stood in silence for a moment before she added, "There's something else I've been meaning to ask you. The shoe Peter was repairing, do you recall who it belonged to?" Grimshaw looked up, startled. "Why, it was from the usual box. We get repairs dropped off weekly. I didn't check." "But it wasn't from the usual box, was it?" she said gently. The sole was stitched differently. Newer thread. It hadn't been worn in months, yet it arrived the day before the murder. Grimshaw's brow furrowed. "I assumed Peter brought it. In himself. Never gave it much thought." "I believe he did," Miss Marple said. "But not for repair. He was hiding the letter, and he needed something that wouldn't draw attention." Her voice softened. "I believe he took the boot from the vicarage, from a box meant for the charity drive." Grimshaw's eyes widened. "The vicar?" Miss Marple shook her head. "Not the vicar. But perhaps someone close by, someone who would have worn such a boot once but no longer had use for it." She didn't elaborate further. She didn't need to. Back in her cottage that evening, she set the kettle on and arranged her teacup and saucer with quiet precision. Bastable, her cat, circled her ankles before settling on the arm of the chair. Purring softly, a knock at the door came just as the clock struck 6. She opened it to find Emily March standing there, her face unreadable. "I suppose you know," Emily said softly. "I usually do," Miss Marple replied, stepping aside. They sat in silence for a few moments, tea steaming between them. "It wasn't meant to be this way," Emily began. "I didn't kill him, I swear that." Miss Marple waited. "He asked questions," Emily continued. "About the letter, about Cartwright and Lane. But he didn't know everything. He didn't know about the funds." "What funds?" Miss Marple asked calmly. "The Guild's legacy," Emily said. "The Order of the Soul. They had money hidden accounts that could be claimed by anyone with proof of descent. Lane found the documents and tried to claim them, but someone got to him first. Years later, Peter found the same records. Weatherby panicked. I tried to stop it, but it was too late. You were close to Lane," Miss Marple asked gently. Emily's voice dropped to a whisper. "He was my uncle." Miss Marple said nothing. "I kept the secret," Emily said. "For years, after he vanished, my family denied his existence. I came to the village thinking I'd left it all behind, but when Peter found the papers, I couldn't watch it happen again. I warned him. I told him. To burn it, he wouldn't. And so Miss Marple said quietly, "You let Weatherby know." Emily's hands trembled. "Not directly. I mentioned it to someone who mentioned it to him." "I didn't think he'd go so far." Miss Marple offered a faint, compassionate smile. "You weren't the murderer, Emily, but you turned the wheel." Tears shimmered in the schoolmistress's eyes, but she held them back. "What will you do?" "Nothing," Miss Marple said gently. "The law has what it needs. The rest is for your conscience." Emily nodded once, stood, and left without another word. Miss Marple watched the door close behind her. Outside, dusk had fallen. The sky was a deep lavender, streaked with the last golden lines of sun. The cobbler's shop stood quiet, the mystery beneath its floor finally unearthed. Miss Marple poured another cup of tea, set her knitting on her lap, and began to stitch. There were no more questions to ask, only answers to live with. 2 weeks after the gathering in the church hall, the rhythm of life in Little Winkham had begun, cautiously, to reassert itself. The leaves had turned a shade darker, the hedgerows ripened with late berries, and the cobbled streets once again echoed with ordinary conversation, though still touched, now and then, with that deliberate hush that follows any shared trauma. The cobbler's shop remained closed. A simple wooden sign in the window read "Closed for repairs." Whether that referred to the building or the man who worked inside, no one could quite say. Harold Grimshaw had been seen only twice once fetching post from the village box, and once walking aimlessly across the green before vanishing back inside. People gave him a wide berth. More from awkwardness than fear, some whispered that he might never open the shop again. Others said he was waiting for the last remnants of scandal to settle like dust on a windowsill. Miss Marple, for her part, had returned to her quiet routines. Her roses were pruned, her knitting was nearly finished, and her attendance at the Wednesday card group resumed as though it had never lapsed. She did not speak often of the castle, certainly not in the open, but when prompted by Reverend Pelham one afternoon on the matter, she replied only, "There are some truths that take longer to be digested, best to let the village to slowly." Sergeant Hargreaves had since departed back to Laftonbury, satisfied with Weatherby's signed confession and the recovered documents. The strong-box from beneath the floor was now in police custody, along with the remains of the parchment scrolls, the cracked seal of the Order of the Soul, and the ledger bearing the names of long-forgotten members. Hargreaves had referred to it as a curious slice of guild history in his report, but Miss Marple suspected it would be quietly filed away, classified, and left to gather the same dust that had hidden it for so long. The case was officially closed, but Little Winkham, being a village, never truly closed its cases. It stored them like old recipe books or letters from distant relatives in tidy corners of memory, to be reopened at tea tables, whispered over fences, or reimagined on long walks through the churchyard. On one such walk, Miss Marple came across Agnes Pritchard, seated on a weathered bench beneath the sycamore tree, her knitting folded neatly in her lap. They had not spoken privately since Weatherby's arrest. "Miss Marple," Agnes said softly, adjusting her shawl, "you were right about Peter. He wasn't just clever, he was noble, he was." Miss Marple replied, taking a seat beside her, "and perhaps too brave for the world he found himself in." Agnes looked out across the green, her gaze far away. "I raised him the best I could," she said. "I tried to protect him, but sometimes when they grow up they outpace us." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, and they see things we've chosen not to." They sat in silence for a while, watching a child ride past, on a bicycle far too large for him. Agnes turned, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Do you think Peter forgave me for not saying more?" Miss Marple took her hand gently. "I think Peter knew you loved him, and that you tried. That's often more than many ever know." Later that day, Miss Marple received a visit from Emily March. The schoolmistress stood at the gate, hands clasped, a satchel slung over one shoulder. She looked tired. Older somehow than she had a month ago, but resolute. "I've taken a post in Gloucestershire," Emily said. "A girls' school, quiet, rural, new faces." Miss Marple regarded her for a long moment, then nodded. "Sometimes a change of scenery is what's needed." "I want to teach them better than I was taught," Emily added. "About truth, about consequences." Miss Marple smiled, her expression gentle. "Then I believe Peter would be proud." She did not ask Emily to stay, nor did she offer forgiveness. That, she knew, was not hers to give. But she watched the young woman walk away with a straight spine and a quiet dignity, and that, at least, felt like some kind of justice. By the end of the week, the last of the speculation had begun to quiet. The talk shifted to the harvest festival, and whether the church organ could be repaired in time for the autumn concert. Mrs. Denby had resumed selling toffees with her usual flair, and the vicar's wife was once again seen distributing marmalade. Jars door-to-door, complete with gingham-teed lids and hopeful smiles. One final visit brought the mystery to its close. Harold Grimshaw arrived at Miss Marple's cottage unannounced, hat in hand, coat flapping awkwardly in the breeze. He stood on her porch for a full minute before knocking. She opened the door. Before he could summon the nerve, "Mr. Grimshaw," she said with a smile, "do come in, I've just made a fresh pot." He sat across from her with the rigid posture of a man not used to talking. His eyes darted once to the fire, once to the cat, and then back to the floor. "I wanted to say thank you," he managed at last. Miss Marple poured his tea without comment. "I thought," he continued, "that I'd be blamed for everything. I thought I'd spend the rest of my days under suspicion. But you knew better. I only followed the logic," she said gently. "It was all there, the pattern, Peter's courage, and your innocence." He gave a dry, almost humorless chuckle. "Not so innocent. I let that boy work alone. When I knew he was chasing something dangerous, I buried myself in my work and ignored what didn't fit. But you didn't lie," Miss Marple said. "And you didn't kill him. That's what matters now." Grimshaw looked up, eyes glinting in the soft lamplight. "I'm thinking of reopening. But not the same as before. No, I'll still mend shoes, but I'll keep the back room clear. Maybe use it as a reading room, a place for the village children. Somewhere quiet, safe." Miss Marple nodded, a small smile touching the corners of her mouth. "That sounds like a fine idea." He finished his tea, left his thanks, and stepped out into the cooling evening. As twilight fell over Church Lane, Miss Marple finally returned to her seat, the teacup still warm in her hands. The fire crackled softly. Bastable stretched beside her. The clock on the mantel ticked evenly, neither hurried nor hesitant. She gazed into the flames for a long time. Murder in Little Winkham had not come with theatrics or grand gestures. It had crept in silently, buried beneath layers of old secrets and sealed letters, but, as always, it has revealed itself through human nature. Pride, fear, greed, and guilt, each more revealing than any fingerprint or forensic report, and in the end, it had been a boy's unpolished courage, not evidence, that had brought the truth into the light. Miss Marple, ever observant, ever kind, took another sip of tea and began to knit again, and though peace had returned to the village, she knew well enough it would never stay forever, not in a place where people, like flowers, grew close together, not in a place where roots always ran deeper than they seemed.